So before I could start the final assembly, there were still a couple parts for the chassis and exterior that needed to be painted. Also, before painting, some of these parts could be assembled as they need to be assembled after painting anyway, and the color of these parts needs to be the same too. So these were all assembled with some regular super glue, prepped, primed, and painted. When the glue dried, I moved on into the spray booth, priming all of the parts with one light coat of primer, and then spraying them in various different colors, ranging from some red, black, and silver mostly. The exhaust itself was painted silver first, and then I decided to weather it a bit with some heat staining using some alclad burnt metal. With a lot of the interior detail parts also done with carbon fiber and the side plates on the exterior, I decided to do some more carbon on the exterior too, mainly the rear diffuser and also the side mirrors. These were done in multiple parts and I'm going to show you right now. While applying these carbon fiber decals, I also decided to apply the rest of the decals for some of the other parts that needed to be clear coated afterwards too. On the engine cover or manifold, there were some decals applied by me, the Skill Production carbon fiber decals on the airbox, and also some of the kit decals. Same goes for the main engine bay itself. This was fully kitted out with carbon fiber, and then some kit decals too. A couple of small sections needed to be painted in either black or silver with a brush, so I did that right here, and then afterwards covered the entire thing with a clear coat to blend it all together. All of the decals are applied, some of the smaller details were painted on, everything is nice and cured and could be moved on to the next stage. In this case, I'm just sealing it all with some gloss clear coat from Streetblisters. The parts were all set aside to cure overnight, and then I could move on to adding additional details to some of the engine parts and also the chassis itself before I could start assembly. bottom half of the engine will probably never be seen again after all the components and body have been assembled, but I still decided to give it a bit more of detail with some black paint and also a bit of weathering prior to assembly. The engine is fully assembled, so I could move on to the chassis side, putting on some of the suspension pieces, the drivetrain, and all the other parts that need to be put together here as well. With all the parts of the chassis now assembled, I could put the interior in and start on detailing and painting some of the exterior parts. So to start off on the exterior side of things, the clear parts were all masked off with some tape, and then I could paint the black edge surrounding it. For this black edge, I decided to use some of my Vallejo paints, specifically the flat black, and apply it in multiple thin coats. Now I'm wondering if there are some other paints you guys would recommend for this specifically. Most of the time I just use these Vallejo paints for some of the interior detail and on the exterior as well, but mainly just smaller components. Now I have noticed on the glass that when I'm painting this on, it does scratch off really easily. Now it isn't that strange, of course, as these parts are super smooth and the paint doesn't really have anything to grab onto. Now I would like to know what paint you guys use specifically for these glass parts, and if you've noticed something similar to this, that it does scratch off really easily and doesn't really bond to the paint itself. Let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts are. With the painting of the clear parts and all the additional details now out of the way, I decided to add some Panelline accent color. The Panellines themselves were pretty nice and deep, but still showed a lot of the yellow body color. I wanted to have a bit more shade and look like they are actual panels, so I decided to add this color in there to give it a bit more depth and realism, and could then start the final assembly. Now normally when gluing in clear parts, I'm using some Bob Smith Industries Super Gold Plus. This works really quickly and is a pretty strong glue as well. However, it's pretty much a super glue, so when you put the glue on, it's permanently on there most of the time, and it's really easy to damage and mess some parts up. So I wanted to try some other glue as well that is a bit more forgiving and just as easy to work with. but also doesn't really mess up the parts if you mess the glue job off, of course. The parts were cleaned up with a microfiber cloth from the inside so that there were no more fingerprints or dust on it prior to gluing it in. I wouldn't have minded using the crystal clear in this case as well, however the parts were slightly bent and needed a bit more adhesion, so I went with the Super Gold Plus. Once those were all in, I let them cure for a couple of hours before moving on to the next stage, and that was wiggling the chassis and body together, snapping, cracking, and pretty much pressing it all together. The rear section really easily hooks into the back bumper. On the front there isn't really anything to hook into, so I decided just to glue it all together with some super glue. So if you've seen recently, I did a couple reviews on some 3D printers, and I used those along with some files from our friend Slowly Models to print out some wheels, some discs, and some calipers to customize this build. These calipers and discs were found on Thingiverse. I will leave a link in the description down below. They were all painted up and clear coated with zero paints afterwards. Additional details were added and could then be glued in place with some super glue. Now the wheels were just wide enough to fit inside of the wheel wells and pretty much fit perfectly on the rear. So just a little bit of glue and these were stuck to the original hubs. On the front they were just a little bit too wide with the hub itself, so I decided just to cut that down a little bit and then glue them in place just like the rear. The rear view mirror needs to be glued onto the inside of the front windshield, and then the windshield could be glued in as well. When test fitting the headlight lenses, I noticed that there were still some areas of yellow clearly showing through after the lenses had been glued in place. So instead of just gluing them in and leaving that yellow visible, I decided just to paint those edges with some black to hide it and blend in more with the headlight bucket itself, and afterwards glue the lens on top of it and you won't see any yellow anymore. After gluing the side mirrors in place and putting the wipers on, this build is finished. Like I briefly mentioned in the videos, the wheels, discs, and calipers were custom 3D printed on my Elegoo Mars 3D printer. I set the layer height at 0.01 millimeters. It took a couple of hours, but the prints that came out were pretty much perfect and could be used instantly. a couple layers of paint, clear coat, and additional details, and they could be put onto the build. If you're interested in the wheels, I will leave a link in the description down below to Slowly's models. He has multiple wheel sets and other designs on his page, and also the calipers will be linked too, along with all of the other projects used in this video. Thank you, Revell, for sending me out this kit to build for you guys, and I hope to see you on the next build.